Have you ever stood in front of an insane view, you've hit the shutter, and then the shot looked kind of boring when you got home and you threw your SD card into your camera? Well, of course, I've been there as well. And if you want to avoid that desperate feeling, sinking feeling of failure, then there is a simple photography framework that you can follow that takes you all the way from finding unique locations to shoot to taking the shot and then processing it to a professional standard. So if you're ready to start taking professional level landscape photos that you can truly be proud of, well, I'm going to run you through the entire framework in this video. Okay, so here's the thing that most photographers miss. They go out, they find a nice view, they point their camera at it, and then they hope for the best. And sometimes it works, obviously most of the time it really doesn't. Now, I've gone from having never taken a landscape photo in my life to becoming an award-winning landscape photographer who now coaches other photographers in under 3 years or so by following a slightly different path. And I discovered that the difference between a professional landscape photographer who consistently gets great shots and the ones that occasionally get lucky, well, it's not talent, and it's not the gear that they're using either. They're having consistent levels of success because they're following a repeatable photography system that they run through every single time that they go out to shoot. Now, I call these systems, these processes, photography frameworks, and following them is the quickest way to get professional level results. So with all that said, let's start at the very beginning, picking and planning your location, because this is where most photographers get it absolutely, completely and utterly wrong before they've even left the house. To find a beautiful location to shoot, first I search Google Images for the rough location name and then plus landscape photography. And straight away I'm going to get a clear picture of what's possible at that location. And this is basically free research that other photographers have already done for you. Then, and this is the bit that photographers often skip, I open Google Earth and I'm going to go into the 3D view. I'm going to rotate around this location to get a feel for the terrain, and then I'm going to drop the little yellow man down into any nearby spots that have opportunity to see the 3D imagery there. I'm going to take a look around. I'm going to search for potentially a background or foreground for my shots. I'm going to do half of my location scouting in Google Earth there and then. Now, once I've scouted this location, I've got a half decent idea of at least the direction I want to be shooting in and where there's likely going to be some foreground interest. I start then looking for footpaths and car parking to make sure that getting to the shooting spot is going to be as seamless as possible, which is what you need when you're going to have to get up at 5, 6, 4 a.m, who knows, to get there for the right timing, which we're going to cover in a second. And with that, you've got your location sorted. But there is something else that took me a long time to figure out: how to be at that location at the right moment to grab the right shot. Now, the conditions that you are shooting in can absolutely make or break a landscape shot. And the good news is that it's pretty easy to predict them. So to predict the sun's location, I use a free website called suncalc.org. And you just drop a pin on your location or where you're going to be shooting from. Pick the exact time and date that you're going to be shooting there, and it shows you where the sun is going to be. So if I want the sun coming from a particular direction, maybe behind me to light up a mountain, or coming in low from the side to create a long, warm light in golden hour, I can then work out the exact time that I need to be stood there, composition nailed, ready to press the shutter button. Then for cloud cover, I use windy.com to forecast 3 separate things. If I'm shooting during the day, I want gappy clouds above me so the light can get through and light up my foreground and background. If I'm shooting in golden hour, then I want a gap at my horizon for the sun to be able to pop through, to again be able to light up the scene that I'm shooting. And then any time of the day, if there's rain or snow or some interesting weather heading in my direction, I want to be at the location that I'm going to shoot from so that the weather is coming in or out and I'm catching that point of transition. And these points of transition are often what leads to the most epic conditions to shoot in. So again, I'm predicting all of this and I'm making sure that I'm spending 90% of the time that I'm outside with my camera being productive. So if you're following the framework, at this point you've locked in a promising location and you've got some hopefully epic weather conditions on the way. And if you get the next step of the framework right, then you're almost guaranteed a professional level landscape image. Now, a lot of amateur photographers, they pull their camera out of the bag and they shoot what they feel looks good in the moment. And if that works for you, then great, fantastic. But there is a process to capturing and creating beautiful compositions, and it's dead easy to follow. And this is what I do every single time I'm out with my camera. First, I start with my background element. The mountain, the lighthouse, the dramatic sky, whatever it is, whatever drew you to this location in the first place. And why do we start with the background? Well, there's way fewer backgrounds in most locations than there are foregrounds or midgrounds. So get your background locked in, and that narrows narrows our focus, our scope for the shoot, and it makes everything else easier. So once your background is secured, then it's time to look for your foreground. So look for something that is interesting, that's obviously closer than your background, so it becomes a foreground. And this could be flowers, rocks, patterns in sand. It could be absolutely anything that is interesting as you look at it. The goal with your foreground is that it is the starting point for your viewer to enter the photo and start spending a little bit of time looking around it. Next, we're going to look for a way to tie them together, so tie your foreground and background together. And this is the creative bit. So we're going to look around the scene for leading lines, shapes, patterns, anything that links your background to your foreground so they don't end up being two separate photos in the same frame. And the general idea is that our viewer comes into the frame or photo looking at the foreground, they find their way up to the background, and then they're satisfied because they've now seen 90% of the image. So that's what we're looking to do when we're tying these two elements together. And then once you've got all of these elements lined up, the final step in creating a professional level composition is to arrange everything in your scene so it looks aesthetically pleasing. Now, don't stress over this step, because if you've got all the other bases covered in the framework so far, you're going to be 90% of the way there by default. But here we're going to look at the rule of thirds, leading lines, balancing out the elements within the scene. We're making sure that there's nothing messy creeping in from the outside of the frame that just makes things look a little bit amateur and unconsidered, basically. And that is your composition nailed. So now it's time for the big moment. You're ready to press the shutter button. But what camera settings should you be using to capture a perfectly sharp, perfectly exposed photo every single time? Right, let's talk about actually getting the shot. And I want to keep this really simple, because perfect exposure, forget what other people on YouTube tell you, honestly, with modern mirrorless cameras, it isn't very complicated. There's an order to select in your camera settings, and if you follow that order, you can't really go too far wrong. So the first thing to set for your landscape photo is your shutter speed. And the job of your shutter speed is to freeze or blur movement in your scene. So let's say you take a picture of a waterfall and you want that silky, smooth, kind of cliche look that everyone goes for with waterfall photography. Well, of course, you're going to want a longer exposure. Whereas if you're photographing trees and it's a breezy day and they're moving around slightly, you need to use a much faster shutter speed to freeze the action. So be intentional about this. Figure out what you want the movement in the scene to look like and then set your shutter speed accordingly. Next, we're going to select your aperture, and this controls the depth of focus that you're going to get with your shot. So again, intentionally ask yourself, how much of the scene from foreground to background do you want in focus? Now, this is pretty easy for landscape photography. For most landscape photos, you want the shot to be sharp from the front to the back. So you're typically going to be working with an aperture between f8, f16, especially if you've got a foreground element in your shot. And so just select an aperture where the front of the scene is sharp and the back of the scene is acceptably sharp as well. And once you've set your shutter speed to freeze the action and your aperture to get that depth of field, you then just raise your ISO until your histogram is pushed as far to the right as it can go before it starts touching that right hand side. And it's really that simple. Once you've set your shutter speed to freeze your action and then your aperture to increase the depth of field to the point at which the front and the back of the scene are in focus, then we're going to raise our ISO until our histogram is pushed as far to the right as it can go before it starts touching the right hand side of the histogram. And then we're just pulling up the brightness of the image with our ISO so we've got enough data to work with when we edit our photos. So you've now captured a professional looking RAW file. Congratulations! Now what do we need to do to turn that raw image and transform it into this final printable, shareable, beautiful landscape photo that we can put in front of our friends, family, social media and get the pat on the back that we deserve? Well, what we've got to do next is edit it. So the goal with your editing is to translate the raw file that's on your computer into something that represents what you saw with your eyeballs when you were stood there in front of the scene when you captured it. So the first thing to do before you touch any sliders, any dials, is to build a mental picture of the end result that you'd like to achieve. I'm asking myself questions like, what did it feel like when I was stood there taking the image? What did the colours look like? How bright or how dark were things? And this image that I build in my head of the scene as I saw it becomes my target as I work through the editing process. I then follow this simple series of slider adjustments to make sure that my edits come out looking professional every single time. Okay, so the first step in editing our image is to get the basics right before we start touching color or we get more creative with our editing. So pick your aspect ratio, straighten your horizon, crop the frame to make sure that the balance of the elements are pleasing within the shot itself, and then sort out your global brightness. And this is important because your camera captures light very differently to how your eyes see light and your brain interprets it when you're stood there out in nature. And so that often means to recreate the dynamic range that you experienced when you saw the scene in front of your eyes, you need to push up the shadows and pull down the highlights. A linear gradient with a curve on the sky is also brilliant for this, and it lets you balance out a bright sky with a darker foreground without looking weird and fake. And then we're going to move on to some global contrast. We don't want to go crazy dramatic here, not at this point anyway. All we're trying to do here is make sure that the full range of the image is visible and it reflects what you saw with your eyes out in the field. Next up, we're going to take a look at the color temperature of your image. And this is dead simple. If it looks a little bit warm, push it towards blue. If it looks a little bit cold, drag it towards yellow. And then I tend to add a little bit of vibrance at this stage. And this is because most RAW files that you're going to open are going to come out undersaturated compared to what the scene was actually like in front of you. So adding just a tiny bit of vibrance brings back that saturation to what you actually saw again in the field. Then we're going to add some depth. We're going to dodge and burn the sides of objects in your shot to make them look more 3D. We're perhaps going to, I do this often, but not every single time, try a vignette around the edge of your image to drag the viewer's eye towards the center of your shot. And at a high level, that is it. That is the full 16-part framework to creating professional level landscape photos, no matter where you live, what gear you have, how often you can go out and shoot, whether you're a full-time photographer, whether you are a part-time or you're an amateur or you're retired, it doesn't matter. None of the variables matter. That is all you've got to do. If you run through those steps, you're going to come up with some amazing, stunning landscape photos. And for context, here is the shot I got as I ran through this process for this video. And remember, professionals follow a process to engineer luck and success, whereas amateurs, well, they tend to hope for luck, and then they get annoyed when it doesn't happen, and then they get demotivated when it doesn't happen over a long enough period of time, and then they get miserable about it, they just put the camera on the shelf, it gathers dust, and then the dream of taking landscape photos kind of fades into another hobby that has just died a complete death. And so, with that said, if you feel a little bit stuck with your current photography skill set, watch this video right now. It's going to help you break through the plateau that you're currently stuck on, and it's going to dramatically accelerate your process to creating professional level landscape photos.